Welcome to Securing America with me, Frank Gaffney, the program that's a kind of owner's manual for protecting the country we love against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to the glory of God and his kingdom. We have a lot to cover with our extraordinary guests, but first, here's my take. In Poland last week, President Biden threw rhetorical matches into a potential nuclear tinderbox. He suggested that the 82nd Airborne would soon be in Ukraine, and his subsequent declaration was even worse, namely that Russian dictator Vladimir Putin cannot remain in power. These comments invited preemptive action by the Kremlin. A powerful webinar sponsored by our Committee on the Present Danger China last week, entitled Preventing Nuclear War, This Is No Drill, established that given Putin's doctrine, preparations, and paranoia, such loose talk could well precipitate his first use of nuclear weapons. I urge you to view this must-watch 2-hour video at presentdangerchina.org. The speed with which the White House walked back both statements suggests the magnitude of the danger. It also made clear that Joe Biden is not in charge. Unfortunately, far less clear is who actually is running the country. Several conclusions follow from this latest Biden debacle. First, it's time for Joe to go. If loose lips could sink ships in World War II, today they can precipitate unimaginable mass destruction. President Biden's manifest and escalating infirmities disqualify him from serving further as the nation's commander-in-chief. Even if Mr. Biden were not medically unfit, he would be by the extent of his compromise by hostile powers, including both the Russians and the Communist Chinese. The magnitude of this travesty is now being exposed thanks to Jack Maxey's forensic examination of Hunter Biden's laptop. Second, if President Biden won't do the honorable thing and voluntarily resign, perhaps citing health reasons or a desire to spend more time with his crime family, the 25th Amendment must be invoked to remove him. And third, as a necessary safety net on the elevation of Kamala Harris to the presidency, a new nonpartisan vice president must be appointed and confirmed, one with a robust national security background who will promise not to run in 2024. That individual, ideally a highly accomplished and regarded senior retired military officer like General Jack Keane, should be principally responsible for the formulation and conduct of the administration's foreign and defense policies in this dangerous moment. The next 2 years are going to be extremely fraught for America and what's left of the free world. We cannot safely navigate them with the present leadership and must move now to put a new, competent, and patriotic team in place faithfully to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Let me turn now to our first guest. He is Kevin Freeman. He's a chartered financial analyst by training and host of Economic War Room on Blaze TV and other platforms. He's the author of Secret Weapon and Game Plan, and I'm very pleased to say a regular here at Securing America. Welcome back, Kevin.
Thank you, Frank.
Well, I've sort of laid out my sense of where we are, Kevin, and I'd be very interested in your take on it. You are a member of our Committee on the Present Danger China. You didn't participate in our program on preventing nuclear war, but I know you're keenly aware of just how dangerous this moment is. Your thoughts on both Biden's performance last week in Poland and more generally in Europe, and what we need to do now?
Well, there's no question, Frank, that the President of the United States carries a heavy burden. And one of those burdens is to speak carefully. And President Biden seems unable or unwilling to do that. That puts all of our nation at risk. He, unfortunately, is a loose cannon at this point, even as perceived by the White House insiders. I mean, they're having to walk him back repeatedly. They're having to pull him off stage. He walks on stage and basically says, "Am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to say this?" So
I'm going to get in trouble if I stay, or things like that. I mean, it's incredible, which raises the question, Kevin. I mean, you follow these things very closely. Do you have any idea who's actually running the United States at the moment?
Well, historically, we've had circumstances where Woodrow Wilson was incapacitated and his wife really ran the government. I have no idea. I don't know if it's Jill Biden, the first lady. I don't know if it's Kamala Harris. I don't know if it's insiders. And that's a dangerous thing in itself because there is no accountability. Whoever's running him is unelected. And as a result of that, we're now being held captive as a nation.
Right. So this raises the question, what do you do about it? I've proposed that Joe should do the honorable thing and resign. In the past, I think in the course of the election, if memory serves correctly, he suggested that he may at some point simply say, look, I'm not medically up to this at the moment. I will resign. Failing that, do we have any other recourse really at this point but the 25th Amendment?
Well, there's the 25th Amendment, and there's the potential for impeachment. I mean, if he is compromised by foreign powers, the Congress needs to act. So the cabinet or the Congress both have an opportunity to step in and preserve the nation. At moments of extraordinary crisis like we're facing, good men and women must do the right thing for the sake of the country. And I think this is one of those moments.
I'd like to just ask you a bit about this compromise business. As you know, Kevin, our Committee on the Present Danger of China has sponsored great work by Trevor Loudon and Sam Faddis at accountabilityinitiative.org, where we've not only talked about the problem of Joe Biden's compromised by the Chinese Communist Party, but we've talked about that of much of his senior administration. Jack Maxey has been doing some incredibly important work with a sort of forensic deep dive on Hunter Biden's laptop. Some of the information that he's teased out of it, mostly in the form of sort of following the rabbit holes into various things that were sort of referenced or cited, but the links were not pursued by the people who've looked at this hard drive from hell, as it's called, to this point. What is your take on what we've learned so far? And do you think it rises to the level of, high crimes and misdemeanors?
Well, when you look at just the very simple facts that we know, laptop or no, we know Burisma, we know Ukraine, we know energy policy, we know Chinese investments and so forth, that alone deserves investigation, and it should be investigated. And it should be investigated by the media as one of the beginning points. And unfortunately, that's not happened. As you look further and deeper into the laptop, you see what appear to be multiple crimes. If you or I had a laptop of that nature, I have no doubt we would be in jail at this moment. And so, yes, it needs to be investigated. It needs to be investigated in congressional inquiry. It needs to be investigated by the Justice Department. It needs to be investigated by the American people and the media and so forth. It is full of so many things that suggest corruption. And then you have the president talking about his son so glowingly. I mean, this is not a good kid I would be super proud of, but he says he's the smartest man he's ever met, or something along those lines. This is a very dangerous situation. And again, it goes back to your first point, compromise.
Yeah, especially by our mortal enemies, notably the Chinese Communist Party and arguably the Russians. We have to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more with Kevin Freeman. We're going to talk a bit about what do we do next beyond the impeachment or resignation to fill the void. That and more straight ahead. We're back, and we're visiting with Kevin Freeman, the host of a terrific program entitled Economic War Room with Kevin Freeman. You can find it at Blaze TV and other platforms. You can also follow the extraordinary battle plans that he produces from each show at economicwarroom.com. Kevin, we've talked about the magnitude of the problem and the fact that I think we agree Joe must go. The President of the United States is unfit, well, it seems increasingly ill health, and perhaps so deeply compromised as to really pose a national security threat. If he were to leave voluntarily or be removed by the 25th Amendment, the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, would fleet up to become president, which is a very, very frightening thought for many of us who've watched her operate in recent years. But it also creates an opening. It would create a vacancy that would need to be filled through an appointment and then confirmation by the Congress for another vice president. I've suggested that we need somebody with a deep, nonpartisan, and hopefully accomplished background in national security, and who would hopefully be really ready to step in at day one to help manage the critical national and international challenges that we're facing at the moment. Your thoughts on that prospect and whether we might get someone who would say, look, I'm not interested in becoming the next president. I'm not going to run. I'm just here to serve on the interim basis to get our country through this rough patch. What do you think?
Well, I think it's a good idea. I also think it's somewhat wishful thinking in that the cabinet is composed of people that whoever's running the president, they've established the cabinet. And therefore, it's unlikely that cabinet's going to turn on President Biden as long as they're successfully using him as a puppet, which is very sad, given his mental condition and given all of that. And the Congress is unlikely to impeach without something so blatant. I mean, if you have the laptop, as blatant as that is. But in terms of a replacement, I would just suggest that whoever we put is aware that we're in an economic war. And, that's my mantra. We're facing economic challenges that are unprecedented, and yet we still think we're the king of the hill, and we still think that we control everything. But we are watching our economic power quickly stripped away. And the Ukraine conflict, we're exercising those power, and Russia and China are just laughing to a certain degree. So, this is a serious moment in American history.
Well, one of the reasons we value so much your regular contributions to this program, as well as the work you do on your own, is that you've been ahead of the curve on this economic war room and its content, subject matter, long before there was such a program. And I want to just say that one of the things you've taught me about, and I want to invite you to, sort of update on, is that as a result of the economic war we're clearly in with Russia now, in retaliation for the invasion specifically, we're watching Russia and China and other nations intensifying a longstanding goal of both Moscow and Beijing, among other places, namely to de-dollarize the world's economy, as they say, to eliminate the dollar status as the reserve currency of the world. Give us an update on where we stand with that, Kevin, and whether it is indeed an imminent prospect at this point.
Certainly. Well, in 2008, Vladimir Putin looked at the dollar and the exorbitant privilege that we have having the reserve currency of the world, and he said that's got to stop. And he tried to get the Chinese to join him. They said no. In 2013, Xi Jinping decided we need to de-dollarize the world, and they've been at it ever since. And now we're flexing our economic muscles only to find that Russia and China have created alternative systems where they may not need U.S. dollars any longer. And we might win the battle, that is, get Putin out of power or stop him in Ukraine using economic weapons, but lose the war and have the dollar no longer be considered valuable on a global basis. That would make us the greatest debtor nation in history, $30 trillion begging our neighbors to help please finance our debt or watch our economy collapse like Venezuela, Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, and so forth. That's the risk that we're facing right now. We're playing Russian roulette, so to speak, with the U.S. dollar.
The question that always arises is there's clearly that appetite, again, not just on the part of the Chinese and the Russians, but others as well, to have a different arrangement, shall we say. To put a fine point on it, we've seen in recent weeks the Indians agreed to buy Russian gas with rupees. We've seen the Saudis agree to sell their oil to the Chinese in yuan. Are those, in fact, alternatives to the dollar, or are, as we've been told by some of our friends and colleagues, there are really no good alternatives to the dollar, and it may be, in trouble, but there's really no place else for people to go. What are your thoughts, Kevin?
Well, several thoughts. Number one, the old argument was everybody loves the dollar. That'll never happen. Nobody will walk away from it. Well, that was proven wrong. Now the new argument is, well, there's no really good alternative. I would ask them to turn on any financial news and see Bitcoin popping up and the popularity of Bitcoin. We also have the International Monetary Fund that wants to create a basket of currencies that they'll offer. We have the Chinese developing digital yuan. There are many alternatives to the U.S. dollar. I don't know which one will emerge or if it will be multiple of them. But regardless, the U.S. dollar is no longer king dollar, is no longer in the power position it once was, and it's in danger of losing any of its position if we're not careful. Remember, the sun never set on the British Empire also, and we see what happened there.
Yeah, and we've actually had the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Jay Powell, openly express the possibility that there could be multiple reserve currencies, which it would seem to be a straw in the wind that at least he anticipates there will be real rivals to the dollar emerging, as you say, perhaps in those quarters. You actually have an idea about a way that people in this country particularly could hedge their bets on what is happening to the dollar, specifically because of the endless printing of more of it by the Federal Reserve and the Treasury. Talk a bit about what you see as a constitutional opportunity, Kevin.
Well, that's a good point. It's not my idea. It was the idea of the founders. They said that the Congress could establish the coining of money, and states were not allowed to coin money, but they could make gold and silver coin legal tender in their state. The problem with gold and silver coin is how do you pay with a 1 ounce gold coin? How do you pay for a $2 cup of coffee? It's not easy. But if you add technology to it, like the blockchain, like a Bitcoin, and you have a gold-backed coin issued by a sovereign state under the Constitution, which would be legal tender, you eliminate almost all of the problems that you would have using gold and silver, and you create a sound money alternative here in the United States that could rise up if the dollar were displaced. And it would make for better money. It would be gold backed by a state. We could guarantee privacy. It would be infinitely divisible, so you could pay 1/10,000th of an ounce of gold for something, and it would be based on the Constitution. I think it is the ideal currency alternative, and I think we need to implement it as rapidly as possible. I'm talking to people in the state of Texas and saying, would you do this? I'm getting great response. I think it is the best possible alternative, and it would force the Federal Reserve to offer a reasonable digital dollar in competition, because competition makes things better. And it would certainly be better than a digital yuan where they have social credit scores and all the manipulations, or the IMF or anyone else trying to manipulate and control the U.S.
Provided, and this is a very important proviso, which we will come back to you on next week if we can, Kevin, there are privacy understandings and commitments being made by the issuers, whether it's Texas or the Federal Reserve. But that's for another day. Kevin Freeman, thank you for your great vision on economic warfare matters especially, but on so much more as well. Keep up the good work at Economic War Room and come back to us again next week if you would. Bill Walton joins us next. We're back, and we're joined by one of our regulars, I'm pleased to say, Bill Walton. He is a former master of the universe on Wall Street, the president of Alliant Capital. He is also, these days, the host of a terrific podcast, televised podcast. It's called The Bill Walton Show, and he's been gracious enough to do Home and Home with me from time to time, and it's good to have him back on our program. Bill, thanks so much for joining us again.
Great to see you, Frank.
I want to get into this issue of food insecurity, Bill. We're seeing growing signs that the conflict in Ukraine and the repercussions of it, both for Ukraine and for Russia, as a result of kind of the economic warfare that the Western world has now been retaliating with against Russia for this invasion, is having ripple effects through the markets, notably for wheat, but also for fertilizers. It turns out we are very heavily dependent upon places like Russia, and for that matter, China, even Belarus, for various kinds of fertilizer. What are the implications of all of this as you see it for, well, us, but also an awful lot of other places on the planet?
Well, once again, we're seeing the results of the lesson we learn over and over again about how the political class does not understand the economic world and how interrelated all our economic relationships are from country to country, industry to industry. And what's happening in this specific case is they've discovered to their shock that Ukraine, which I think everybody already knew is the sort of the breadbasket of the world in terms of wheat production, but also that Russia is one of the world's largest suppliers of the key nutrients that go into food production, and specifically potash, and the other one is phosphate. And the other thing is that a lot of the nitrate that we see in our food and as part of the supplements to make it grow better is made from natural gas, also supplied by Russia. And we're seeing all these supply chain shortages in these critical ingredients and a lot of others.
Mm-hmm. The fact is that we have been encouraged to believe by global capitalists, some of whom you used to run around with, that this kind of dependency is actually a good thing. That globalization, as it's been called, it's the engagement with these various countries, the integration, the going for the cheapest supplier without regard for the possible risks associated with dependencies. We're now calling them supply chain dependencies, but dependencies of any kind is a good idea. It certainly seems to be becoming a cropper across the board, and not just with respect to food or the stuff that goes into making it, but flat screens and steel and rare earth minerals. You and I have done a program on your show recently with the great Rosemary Gibson about even medicines we're critically dependent upon from other suppliers, including China. Talk about the advisability in light of present circumstances, particularly of this kind of just-in-time, supply dependency arrangement.
Well, you and I both remember Tom Friedman's incredibly naive book, "The Earth is Flat" or "The World is Flat." I don't remember the exact phrase,
Earth,
but the notion was that we'll have this globalist international world order, and we can function economically as if there were no borders or if there were no differences among cultures, and that everybody would just be singing this happy kumbaya globalist song. Well, what we're finding out now is that was always an illusion, and it's really an illusion. And we've had multinationals, big major multinationals, think in terms of managing their supply chain. The phrase was just in time, which was that you wanted to keep your inventories quite low and manage your investment in inventory by not having much available, knowing you could get it from some other country when you needed it. Well, now we know that's not true, and people are beginning to see, gee, that's the wrong phrase. We need to think of terms of supply chain and supplies as just in case. And in this instance, the just in case is, well, just in case we have Ukraine invaded by Russia, what's that going to do to all of our relationships? And the other thing that, this has such a global effect. I mean, Japan now is watching what's happening with the United States in action in terms of supporting Ukraine. I'm not saying we should, but Japan's looking at this and saying, gee, it looks to me, looks to us like the United States is not going to protect us if China or North Korea or even Russia gets frisky in the Japanese Sea. So they're beginning to behave differently. They're thinking about their supply chain differently, and this is all going to have a major effect on global economic growth and food security.
I think, among other things, they're rethinking their position of depending on us for a nuclear umbrella instead of having
Right,
one of their
right.
own. Bill, even Larry Fink, who we routinely, I think, critique here, has now come forward and said globalization is dead. He blames it kind of on this war thing, but it seems to me it's for a whole host of reasons, including just the sheer inadvisability of it. And yet we're hearing from the Larry Finks of the world and the Klaus Schwabs of Davos, the World Economic Forum, and the like, that, oh, no. Now what we need is a great reset that will take their word for how the world ought to be structured going forward. Um, your thoughts on taking any further advice from these characters, Bill?
Well, thankfully, I didn't take much advice from them before, and most of us shouldn't
Right.
either then or now or in the future. Frank, the effect of the globalists and the elites on what's happening to ordinary people is just stunning. I mean, take a look at the embargo or the shutdown on sales of materials and supplies to Russia. Well, who does that fall hardest on?
Mm.
It doesn't fall hardest on the big multinational companies. It falls on the smaller, medium-sized, smaller companies that are maybe supplying subcomponents to the Russian technology industry, and there are a lot of them.
Mhm.
And all these interrelationships, which Carl Schwab seems blithely unaware of, are now coming to the fore, and they're hurting a lot of people. And they're hurting a lot of our reaction and the embargoes that we put in place because of Ukraine are a lot like the lockdowns we experienced during the pandemic. It's the vast middle class that's getting hurt.
Yes. And unfortunately, it's likely to be a lot more people, especially if the world starts getting reordered along the lines, which it seems the Davos crowd is all about, of the Chinese model and their ideas of how those kinds of dependencies, basically entirely on China, will sort out for the rest of the world. Bill, speaking of China, one of the things that we've been endlessly told we have to cultivate, despite our differences with China, notably the fact that they're waging an unrestricted war against us, is that climate change is of such surpassing importance that we have to, work with the Chinese. The John Kerry, of course, is one of the principal advocates for this idea. Seemingly, to my way of thinking, every bit as dubious a proposition as the Great Reset. But at the same time that is being bruited, we're hearing that the Securities and Exchange Commission here in the United States is now going to use its regulatory power essentially to cram down the throats of American corporations the sort of climate change radicals agenda. What's going on there? And as you know, lived and breathed that Wall Street stuff, what are the implications, would you say, for that business sector of our country?
Well, once again, with the slenderest of majorities, the SEC, with three commissioners, led by Gary Gensler as the chairman, who I believe is from Goldman Sachs, have proposed a ruling on climate change disclosures for all public companies, regardless of what industry you're in, to calculate the impact of your operations on global climate warming or change. It's not even warming anymore. And the costs of this are enormous. Just the compliance costs are going to be or will be 10 to 15 billion dollars. But the real consequence of this is every company is going to be concerned about disclosing in its footnotes, what it's doing pro or con climate change, and it leaves them open to every activist hedge fund and climate change person out there that wants to wreak havoc. And if you're sitting in the seat of most CEOs, they're saying to themselves, well, gee, I don't want to get into all that. Maybe we just ought to cut back on our investment in things that are related to fossil fuels. And so they're getting at this not directly through some regulation from the EPA or whatever, but through the SEC. And as I remember it, the SEC was supposed to protect individual investors. Instead, in mass, it's harming individual investors, and it's only going to get worse.
Well, just to keep up our pace with Larry Fink, we have to recognize that he is one of those who is driving this train on the business side, using the power, the enormous wealth of his company.
But remember,
BlackRock,
he makes his money skimming. He makes his money skimming fees. He's got 10 trillion under management, but his wealth is not dependent on necessarily the compound rate of return on that 10 trillion. It's the fees he can collect from managing the money. Yeah. And as long as he can keep people feeding him money with the fashionable ESG strategies, he's going to keep doing it.
Yeah, well, and fees from China, not least. The environment, social justice, and governance crowd don't seem to be particularly focused on the Chinese absolute indifference to this whole program. Bill, such a bracing set of topics and so little time to cover them, but you've done handsomely. We appreciate the chance to visit with you each week, and we look forward to doing so again next week. In the meantime, I know you'll keep up the great work with your Bill Walton show.
More good news next week.
Soon. More where this came from. That's right. Next up, speaking of good news, we're going to talk with Ken Timmerman, one of our country's leading experts on Iran, and what the implications are of our paying the Iranians to get the bomb. We're back and joined by Kenneth Timmerman. Ken Timmerman is one of our country's preeminent experts on a whole host of issues, having served for, well, decades as a very enterprising and courageous investigative reporter. He's also the author of numerous books, including several concerning Benghazi, dark forces, what really happened in Benghazi being one of the most important of them. He is, in addition to all of that, the president and CEO of the Foundation for Democracy in Iran. And we wanted to talk with him about the prospect that not only are we not going to get democracy in Iran, we're going to get a nuclear-armed one in the near future. Ken Timmerman, it's good to have you with us. Welcome back to Securing America.
Thanks for having me on, Frank. It's great to be here.
I can't tell you how concerned I am, and I'm sure you are, and I think the people of America more generally ought to be, about what the Biden-Harris administration is doing with respect to Iran, and unbelievably, through the most unlikely of intermediaries at that. Give us a quick update on what is going on at the moment, as best we can tell.
Well, what we've learned over the past 10 days or so, Frank, is extraordinary. The Russians are the prime intermediary in the talks between the U.S., the European Union, and the Iranian regime that have been taking place in Vienna.
And it's unbelievable.
You have the Russian ambassador going on television talking about the amazing concessions that the Americans have made at these talks to Russia. It just boggles the mind. We're in the middle of trying to put pressure, at least that's what the administration says, on the Russian government, on their economy. And at the same time, we are guaranteeing them an upfront payment of $500 million from the Iranians to finish pieces of their nuclear program, and most likely enabling Russia to sell oil through the back door through Iran, and through that way also gain access to the international dollar clearing system. It's just crazy.
It's obscene, is what I think it is. It's if possible to have a deal worse than the original so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It sure sounds like the team that brought us that bad deal is now outdoing themselves to come up with such a defective piece of work. Ken, one of the pieces of this that is particularly offensive is that apparently it is going to entail yet another immense transfer of money. You mentioned $500 million. That's chump change compared to what these guys seemingly have in mind doing for their Iranian friends. Give us a sense of the magnitude of it, and what's it likely to be employed to do?
Well, so what we've heard is that the part of the deal will be to unfreeze something like $130 billion of Iranian oil money. This is money that they have earned through illegal oil deals that were banned by the United States, that has been parked in places like South Korea, in Hong Kong, in China, in Japan. And that money will be returned to Iran. It's Iranian money, okay? It is Iranian money, but it has been
illegal oil
sales. And a lot of these oil sales,
they got it illegally, but it's still their money, right?
Right. And a lot of these sales have been done through ship-to-ship transfers, a process that our friends at UANI, United Against Nuclear Iran, have been tracking quite diligently over the past couple of years, where they will have a ship from one country come to an Iranian oil loading port, and then it will go out to sea. They'll turn off the transponder and transfer that oil to another ship that has never been near Iran, and that ship will then take the oil to market, pretending it's something else. So that's how they've been actually doing it, but it's a huge amount of money. What are they going to do with it? You know what they're going to do with it. They're going to fund the Revolutionary Guards, the export of terrorism around the world. They're going to fund their proxy wars in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Iraq.
And in their operations, I'm sure, in places like Latin America and probably here as well. And Ken, not least, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, as I recall, is not only a terrorist operation, an arm of the regime that is used for that purpose, their Quds Force most especially, Hezbollah as well, but they're also the agency that runs the nuclear program, are they not? So if this money migrates into Iran, it will wind up not only sponsoring terrorism on an even heightened scale, but also assuring that Iran gets the nuclear weapon, which we're supposed to be believing this deal will prevent.
Right. Well, this deal gives them a clear pathway to the bomb. There's no doubt about it. It enables them to continue enriching uranium. It allows them to continue installing these much more modern fifth-generation centrifuges as opposed to the first-generation ones that they've had in the past. That's 5 times faster in enriching uranium. It's now believed that they can get enough highly enriched uranium for a bomb's worth of material in a month, 2 months maximum at the current rate. So they are very, very close to nuclear weapons capability if they have not already crossed that threshold.
Yeah, I remember being told they were 10 weeks away about 3 months ago. So presumably they're in tall cotton now. And Ken, this just brings home the problem that these guys, I can't imagine how they're going to sell this deal to anybody. Do they have to sell it to anybody at this point? Is there a congressional oversight and approval process that will be holding them accountable?
Well, remember when the last deal came about in 2015, the administration, the Obama administration, the Obama-Biden administration did not present it to Congress. And it took senators in particular to pass a resolution condemning it, but they could not. They would not have a resolution to approve it. So it was never submitted as a treaty. They're not going to do that this time. They're going to bypass Congress because they know there's widespread bipartisan opposition to this deal in both houses of Congress, even with Democrats in control.
Well, the truth of the matter is, I can't imagine on what basis anybody would support this deal. And I'd be very interested to see who will, other than, I guess, the most devoted supporters of Iran in the United States Congress. Ken, we have to take a short break. When we come back, I want to talk with you about where this leaves the rest of the region at a very, very dangerous moment, and what it's going to mean for our security as well as that of friends on the Persian Gulf, as well as in Israel and more. back, joined once again by Kenneth Timmerman, one of our country's duty experts on Iran and the dangers it poses to the rest of us. And Ken, I wanted to build on what you were just saying about this nuclear deal and the fact that it's clearing the way for Iran to realize the mullah's longstanding ambition to have nuclear weapons, to brandish them, and quite possibly to use them to achieve two goals that, since they first came to power back in the late 1970s in Iran, have been their mantra: death to Israel and death to America. Let's start with Israel. The Israeli government is clearly very, very concerned at the moment about what's in the offing. Tony Blinken, I believe, is visiting there and has been introduced to several of the countries that share Israel's concern, now Arab nations that made peace with the Israelis under the rubric of the Abraham Accords. Tell us what's happening in this diplomatic dance, and more to the point, what options do you think the Israelis are contemplating?
Well, I think for the first time, the Israelis are very seriously contemplating a kinetic response to Iran's program. I have been one of those who have cautioned for a number of years, saying Israel has many other ways of slowing down Iran's nuclear weapons programs besides dropping bombs. They have launched cyber attacks that have been relatively effective. They have sponsored groups inside Iran that have assassinated nuclear scientists who are running the program. But they're getting to the end of that rope, and I think they're getting increasingly closer to running out of time, getting closer to a kinetic response. And what's interesting is, the Abraham Accords, which have gotten the least publicity of any major diplomatic breakthrough. I mean, this is historic in nature, to have Arab countries sitting down, 4 of them at once, and then 5 of them, making peace with Israel without any apparent concessions whatsoever. An amazing accomplishment by Israel. An amazing accomplishment by President Trump and his team. And this team of President-inept Biden has just jettisoned it. They have thrown it out the window, and they have sought to alienate countries like Saudi Arabia. Now, you can think whatever you want of the Saudis. They have a very checkered record, and I am the first to acknowledge that. But there has been change under Mohammed bin Salman, and this administration in Washington despises him, detests him, because they believe that he was involved in the murder of Khashoggi, this young so-called journalist who was actually a Qatari shill in Washington.
Well, I think that may be the pretext for it, but I think they more generally have clearly thrown in with the Iranians, and the Iranians' most important enemy, arguably, other than Israel, at least in the Arab world, certainly is Saudi Arabia. And we've had this spectacle, Ken, of the United States government removing the Iranians' proxies, speaking of terrorism, in Yemen, the Houthis, from the terrorism list, removing the Patriot missile batteries from Saudi Arabia, where they were protecting the Saudis, their oil refineries and the like, from Houthi missiles, rockets, and so on. And then turning around and saying to the Saudis, would you mind pumping some more oil? Because we're in a bit of a crack. This is beyond ineptitude, it seems to me. I think it is a wrecking operation, as I call it. And one of the principal beneficiaries, as we were talking about earlier in the program with Kevin Freeman, has been the Chinese. As well as, of course, the Iranians. Ken, so if the Israelis are getting serious about kinetic responses, feeling as though they've run out of runway or clock or whatever rope, what do you think an administration with the proclivities of the Biden-Harris administration would do if, let's say, for the purposes of discussion, Israel decides to launch airstrikes against Iran? My concern, I must tell you, is, first of all, we're likely to know something about it, not because the Israelis would tell us, but because of our intelligence collection and so on. Do you think, Ken Timmerman, that they would share that information with the Iranian regime, or worse, if it's possible, to actually interfere with such a strike militarily?
And all of those, and punish Israel afterwards. That's what my real fear is. Frank. This is an administration that believes it's better to be an Ayatollah in Tehran building a nuclear weapon than a Jew in your capital, Jerusalem, building an apartment to live in. They will punish Israel. They are anti-Israel, no matter what they say to the contrary. And we see this. Look at their ambassador, Thomas Nyes, who recently was at a conference in Jerusalem, and he was called by the Israelis the Palestinian ambassador because he was more Palestinian than he was American. It's extraordinary. You mentioned earlier, Frank, and I want to just put this one point in there. The people in Congress who support Iran, the supporters of Iran in the U.S. Congress, one of the primary supporters in the U.S. Congress until he became vice president of the United States was Joseph Biden of Delaware. And Biden appeared at all of these fundraisers for NIAC, the pro-Iran lobbying group, and he was supportive of the first Iran deal, and this one, I believe, he's driving it as well. So Biden himself believes that revolutionary Iran is good for America because it weakens America.
Yeah. And that's really the rub, it seems to me, and it kind of the unified field theory that we advance here most days on securing America, Ken, and that is we are dealing with an administration that seems determined to not just weaken America and not just reduce its status and not just humiliate it, but actually to wreck it. And that's what's so mind-boggling about this. It seems to be across the board. It's their domestic policies, energy security being one of them, the border being another, what they've done to us under the rubric of COVID, to say nothing of all of these, foreign policies, Afghanistan, and what you've just described here in terms of betraying our actual friends in the Middle East as to the benefit of our actual enemies. Ken Timmerman, this is deeply troubling stuff, but very vital that we all hear it. We appreciate your clarity on the subject and look forward to talking with you further about this as we learn more about this deal and hopefully can help oppose it. I appreciate the rest of you being with us for this edition of Securing America. As always, I hope you feel better equipped to join us in doing just that. And for more information about what you can do, I hope you'll turn to securingamerica.tv, our website, and that having done that, having taken aboard this information, having hopefully been in a position to now share it with others, that you will go forth and multiply.